Be here now. Just be here now.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Grosso with the Indie Spiritualist podcast on the Be Here Now network. And my guest today is British-American filmmaker Sebastian Siegel. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for taking the time to be with me today.
Chris, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. So before we get started with this conversation, just want to read your bio to let listeners who aren't familiar with you know a little more about you. British-American filmmaker Sebastian Siegel has written, produced, and directed acclaimed trailers, commercials, 2 documentary films, and the feature Grace and Grit, adapted from Ken Wilber's globally popular book. Sebastian is from Oxford, England, and is based in California, where he works as a writer, director, producer, author, and facilitates think tanks engaging numerous modalities of storytelling. Sebastian is currently in development and production of several feature films adapted from both books and true stories. So again, Sebastian, thank you for your time today. I'm so excited to talk to you because so it was the day after my birthday, actually, on June 4th. Grace and Grit came out, and you know what a birthday treat that was. I was actually still traveling back. I just got back from Mount Shasta, California, so I wasn't able to watch it. No, actually, I apologize. I watched it right before I went. See, I'm still in this. Mount Shasta does things to you. For anybody who's been there knows of it. Still coming down from that trip. So anyways, I watched it before I went, and I was deeply touched, shaken to my core. Grace and Grit, as well as One Taste, are 2 of my absolute favorite books of Ken's, hands down. I mean, I love his whole breadth of work, but those are 2 that I often recommend to people. I find they're a little more accessible because, as you know, Ken's work can get very deep. So before we jump into the movie, because I'm sure that's going to take up pretty much the bulk of the conversation, I would love, if you're cool with it, giving a little background about yourself. Like, what led you, first of all, to the path, like Ken's work, but not only that, in general, what led you to an interest in filmmaking and writing and what you do for a living today? And you could start as far back as childhood or wherever. Like, just tell us a little bit about you and what brought you to where you are today.
Can we start with the Big Bang?
Yes, let's
Can we
let's
start
keep
with
it simple.
Big Bang before this one?
Right. So yeah, I love starting easy. Let's ease listeners in.
I think, as light in as much of the joke as that is, right?
Sure.
That there is a deep intuition that echoes out from the origination beyond time.
Yeah.
And there's this, as Ken will write about in many of his books, as is inflected in a lot of the work that you are writing, that is, learned from Ram Dass and influenced by. There's this initial echo of intuition, of transrational thought, and that intuition, that deep impulse, right? The sense of what flower does the bee pollinate, right? Because from a distance, to the bee, all flowers look the same. But then when you get up close, just like any fingerprint, they're all so uniquely different. And so how do we differentiate? How do we discern who to love, what vocation to give ourselves to, what choice to make, what's worth the price of the candle, ultimately? What are we really doing here? And I think that deep intuition is the thing that must guide us, as is inflected deeply in Ken's work and in Ram Dass's work. And so then therefore extrapolated by yourself and myself and other writers and artists and storytellers. So if I think about, if the question is, how did I get in Ken's work? How did I end up doing this film? And what are the things that drive my interest vocationally? Truncated, it's everything interested in consciousness. So it's as a storyteller, whether it's in movies, books, meditation, psychology, but they're all closely related. They seem like different fields, but they're all closely integrated. And we can see across those fields the close integration, whether it's Fritz Perls being the founder of Gestalt and having an interest in theater early on, and then numerous pioneers that cross over, in other words, into what is the stage and what is performance and what is the sense of identity and ego and personality, and how do we project those things, and then how do we, as you say, be here now, around us, be here now. What is it that we're paying attention to that's deep within and far beyond? Who is the I beyond I that's really making the decisions, and can we fully give ourselves up to that decision maker? So I would like to answer the question by deferring to that decision maker and just saying that out of no cognizant sense, I think since I was a kid, out of no moral sense, but just out of a sense of total surrender, perhaps from tumult, perhaps from confusion, just following that deep intuition that I think probably as a kid I had some sense of what's really going on here. And this world is daunting and beautiful and luscious and glorious and tender in so many ways, and cruel and intimidating and tumultuous in other ways. And so I have to surrender fully to whatever that thing is. And so then I think my interests early on were naturally in things that were soothing for the soul, whether it was poetry or music or movies, that storytelling and theater, poetry, music, movies, etc. And so then I think that I had love affairs with a number of different authors, from Ramana Maharshi to Alan Watts to a number of psychologists and philosophers. And then I thought after Alan Watts, it was never going to happen again like that.
Right.
And then it did. It happened with Ken Wilber. I started reading his works, and I was just blown away. And a number of years went by before we met. And eventually we met, and we were sort of simpatico. And then Grace and Grit I read late in his work. And then I think that I'll get to defer again to that decision maker beyond, that somehow that film chose me, that I said, wow, this is such a powerful story and book, and this would make an amazing movie. And then I found out that many people had come before me to make it, and there were already people working on it. So I didn't think anything of it. But then a number of different things unfolded that I ended up being the one to carry the torch for that. I'm deeply grateful to be able to carry that torch, and it was such a honor, to tell that story of a book that's impacted so many people around the world, myself included, and also I think to be able to infuse Ken's work and integral into that movie, into that story, subtly, So,
subtle.
Long story short, I didn't make the decision made, and I just was along for the ride, I suppose.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, so much that I want to unpack there. First of all, subtly, yes, before I watched the film, I'm like, how is this gentleman going to, translate this into film in a way that those who aren't familiar with Ken's work will be able to absorb it? Because again, if you jump into one of Ken's other books, some of his heavier stuff, like for me, my introduction was his, I think it was a 12 CD conversation set with Tammy Simon. It sounds true. Cosmic Consciousness. So I understood maybe 1.3% of that when I heard it, because it was like within the first couple of months, over 20 years ago, but when I stepped foot on the path, but it called to me and the seeds were planted. So I came back and found his work again later on, and he became a friend and helped me understand it at a deeper level, much like I'm sure yourself. So yes, you did quite an amazing job of integrating it. My lady Carissa ended up watching the movie the same night. She's out in Denver, and I'm in Connecticut right now, and she watched it, and she was not familiar with Ken's work, and she was deeply touched, like completely moved by it as I was. And I thought that was an absolutely beautiful testament to the film you created. So before we jump into that, I just wanted to go back and revisit. You mentioned, I heard tumult and tumultuous, something that resonates with me. I was talking with a friend the other day, and, we were saying how most people don't come to the spiritual path, or call it whatever you care to, but because life is unicorns and rainbows, we're usually stumbling or staggering onto it. In my case, it was like rock bottom addictions, and then the bottom gave out, and, literally like crawling onto it. So, that said, what were some of those experiences for you, if you're comfortable sharing with them, and it's okay if not, but also the other thing, and if there's any way you want to tie it together, was you mentioned art and poetry early on, like as being a deep influence for you. for pretty much as far back as you can remember in authors. So I know those are two kind of opposite end questions, but those are two things that really stuck out to me. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on before we jump into the film.
Yeah, I follow with the connection there that certainly my
Like
father,
the grace and the grit. Yeah.
yeah. My father was a professor of comparative religions with a specialty in India, and got a job in Hawaii teaching at University of Hawaii, and was there writing and teaching. So we moved there when I was a kid, and then my stepfather lived in South Texas, and with my mother, and we were in church every Sunday, and it's like yes sir, no ma'am, and hunting and fishing, and I'm very disciplined, and two beautiful worlds, but very very different. And my father was sort of like just ultra intellectual and very hyper creative, and so sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and anything goes. So those two worlds were spectacular. But I think as a young boy, at 4, 5, 6, 7, to just be spending just the summers in Hawaii and then just a year with my mother and my stepfather in South Texas, that there were different rules, and it was hard to understand what those rules were. When I could cuss, when I couldn't, what was appropriate, what wasn't, and to sort of take these two polar worlds, totally opposite worlds, and reconcile them into sort of one cohesive identity required something sort of beyond, or something I had to tap into that seemed true consistently in both worlds. And I think initially those things were like, whether it was poetry, music, by a lot of amazing musicians, whether it was U2 or Marvin Gaye or Roberta Flack, or poets like Khalil Gibran or Edgar Allan Poe, or whoever those things were, that touching something that said, no matter what world I'm in, I'm finding writers that are storytellers or movie makers or musicians that are expressing something that's true to me about heartache, and about how after that heartache, whether it's the heartache of disappointment, the heartache of hope, the heartache of desire, these ultimate things that are really extrapolating upon tenets of Buddhism, how do I push through those things to get to some sort of equanimity beyond, and to still feel passion, but to be able to touch equanimity. And I think that those things all express that, wow, when you're heartache and you're brokenhearted, when we're brokenhearted, we have to allow it. We can't hold on to it. We can't force it and make it not happen. We have to just allow it. And there's this deep breath through that. So then the tumult at some point becomes, this deep spiritual practice, right? Like in a yogic practice, the stretch begins. The yoga begins when the stretch is challenging, right? Most of us would get to the point where the stretch, that's a really hard stretch. Okay, let me just lean into that for a few seconds and then back off. That's the few seconds where the stretch really begins. And it's the same thing with a spiritual practice. Everybody loves to sit and meditate for 30 minutes or an hour, right? A few times for a year or whatever the thing is, but it's after a long time that then we say, wait a second. It's like Chongyam Trungpa writes about, get excited by the boredom, and then get bored with the boredom, and then find this space beyond that. The boredom is what's really going on all the time. Right. In other words, through my eyes, through your eyes, through our eyes, there's always something, right? Just from being here in a world of duality, there's always something that's eliciting a response: desire, thirst, hunger, joy, elation, impulse. Other people, are. But beyond that, there is something that is resonant. Yeah, this causal space that if we can tap into and keep one foot in both worlds, then we can have a sense of, okay, my end is not so important, right? That my death is not so important. My mortality is not so important. I want to be here. I want to love this life with everything I can, but I'm not going to hold on to it so much that I'm forcing the honey out of it, forcing the salt out of it. So I think that the tumult between those two worlds then, to ground that, it resulted in a lot of intensity. As a young boy, I was intense. I was intense in the way that I was do things physically. I was intense in theater. I wanted to push the limits, of whatever it was, cry, laugh, everything. Intensity. I wanted to fall madly in love with other kids when I was a boy. Like, it was just like the poetry I'd write at 10 was like, I'm going to love you forever. It was so intense, and then that resulted in debauchery too. Yeah, sex, drugs, rock and roll. I mean, I started really early on. The first time I was, I smoked a joint. I was 9 and got drunk at 12, and experimented with other drugs at 14 and 15, and fortunately, early on enough to see those things as mechanisms that could either be for my growth or mechanisms that could either be for my falling. And so at some juncture, I thought, okay, there's something here that's valuable, but there's something here that's really, really dangerous, that's foolish rather than dangerous even. And so fortunately, by luck, I was able to, I think, fall deeper in love, so to speak, with the expression and the storytelling, and how ultimately some sense of cohesion was requisite to be able to create depth connection with other individuals. And that ultimately the depth connection was where all the magic was at, right? That if success leaves clues, that anyone I was admiring throughout history, any great writer, author, musician, that it was always about depth connection. Yeah. And so then I think, and I didn't know that, I didn't have that wherewithal then, but I think just intuitively would follow that. Does that answer the question? Because you're talking about the tumult. Yeah.
No, you touched on both and then more, which so eloquently worded, and I resonate with pretty much everything you said. I feel a kinship with you already.
We were at a bar at some point, many years ago, right?
Yes.
We don't remember.
Yes, I am sure. But like right as you quoted Trungpa Rinpoche, like the 2 seconds before you did, it popped up in my head, not verbatim, but something where he says, like, it's better to not undertake the spiritual path whatsoever, like just don't do it. But if you do, you have to be willing to go all the way. And again, that's not a verbatim quote, and I don't remember where that's out of, but that's something I read from him that always stuck with me.
Crazy wisdom. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And especially like when you are really on this and you're not doing the, I don't mean to jab at anybody, but kind of the McMindfulness route of the watered down popular quote unquote spirituality that's still pretty prevalent today, though. Seems like things are shifting a bit in the direction of looking more at shadow work and going deeper, which is wonderful. But yeah, when you're really in it to do this thing, it asks everything of you. And are you willing, to go there, which very much I can take away from what you've said already, and just sharing this space with you. You certainly have and are, as I like to think I am too. And what a gift, it's not all doom and gloom. I want to be very clear, as that the majesty and magic and beauty can be just as overwhelming in a just beautiful way as that pain and tumult can be overwhelming in just a heartbreaking, tragic way.
Beautiful what you're saying, Chris, because I think that New Age spirituality, the one that you're referencing earlier there, is a dangerous drug, because it gets people to the point where they think love is, where what's being sold is read this book and then have equanimity forever.
Right.
Like,
yes.
Love is a warm hug. It's all going to be okay. Thoughts become things, this kind of magical sort of New Age thinking. But somebody has to go through that magical stage to get to the rational stage, to get to the transrational stage. They have to go from pre-conventional to conventional to post-conventional to transrational. Right. In other words, somebody has to start somewhere walking before they can run, before they can float, before we can, float. And I have many friends who are at that stage. Yep. Yeah. And I've been at that stage. Yeah. And the idea. And then at some point, then there's this crush that happens where the true spiritual practice really begins. Right. It's not in the calm of the ocean. It's in the rough, heavy, intense sea. The cool thing, like you're saying, is it's not gloomy. What's amazing is that when you're out there in the deep, rough sea and the crucifixion's coming, you're saying, aha, there's a crucifixion coming. This is hurt. But I can taste, as you say, the majesty on the other side of it. And I'm going to stand through the thing. Right? Stand through the thing. Right. In other words, right, the value of the content of the book. When people are peddling books, right, or peddling, music, or peddling quick, fix programs to say you can feel good. Now everybody wants a piece of that. Right. Then the people keep, coming back saying, hey, that was good. That was a good fix. But what next? It's like even Anthony Robbins will say, like 90% of the people read 10% of the book.
Right.
10% of the people read 90% of the book. There's only a few people that are actually reading the whole book.
Yep.
And the number of people who will get addicted to something that's beautiful. Tony Robbins, amazing communicator, amazing man. But oftentimes people will get hooked on just that high of how good it feels to feel a beat, but then not be able to actually process it and hold it and put it into a discipline of loving, a discipline of transcendence, a spiritual discipline that allows us to continually overcome.
So I couldn't agree more. And I will own as well. Like in a way, it's almost like a rite of passage for most people. I think like we step on the path and it's like a new boyfriend or a new girlfriend. We're so excited. And, for me, I certainly spiritualized my ego like as much as anyone else could. I wore the models, I learned the lingo. I was, trying to like fit in a way that, made sense to me at the time. And that's why I said, I'm not taking a jab, because I totally do get that. Um, I think part of the danger is, and I have a friend named Jeff Brown, who's a wonderful writer, and he calls it the New Cage movement. And he, like, I'm not one to mince words. He goes even farther than I will at times. But he also lost a friend who ended up committing suicide because she had stepped foot onto the path and was into some, I won't name names, but some of the more popular teachers that essentially, it's kind of, they're offering a Band-Aid when you need like a surgery in certain circumstances. And in this case, she ended up taking her life, and he and I have seen people that they do step on the path, and the majority do end up at some point sooner or later taking that next step into the depths, like you were mentioning. But there are those that don't, and I think that's where part of the danger lies in some of the teachings, is that people aren't encouraged. And yes, these books are being pumped out like a lot of popular music. That's like plastic, it's factory made essentially, and just let's give people what makes them happy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think with this, for some people it is life or death, it's just something that needs to be handled very skillfully, and that's not always the case. But and also the other thing I noticed too, or came up for me when you said we want to feel good, even for me, and not that long ago, I caught myself falling back into this, meditating as a means of aversion rather than going deeper into myself. It was a sense of just dropping out for a little while and not having to deal with life, because it felt good and it was transcendent. But luckily, I caught myself like, oh, you're doing that again. No judgment, just where I was, and but come back. You're meditating for other reasons than just to drop out.
Beautiful. There's so few people on the planet will have the capacity to say that. Yeah. And that is like what you touched there is really, that's really the crux. That's really the point where people are looking at that, saying, okay, I'm going to meditate and make everything okay. And then that becomes an egoic, a self-centered, saying, well, I'm going to just feel good. Right, nothing wrong with that. All fantastic. But as you're saying, as avoidance, I mean, that's just, it's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant because so few people are able to actually sit in that place, say, okay, look, I'm going to have this sense of, I'm going to have this meditative practice as me to ground, but I'm also going to go in deep. Yeah, I'm also going to explore my shadow. Where am I showing up for myself, for the vocation, for other people in a way that is in service, or that is a way that is selfish? And where can I catch it? Yeah, where can I see it? Yeah, it's interesting because, if I know that, like, in terms of like having an integral practice, if I'm combining a number of different things, like you're saying, whether it's a meditative practice and playing chess and reading and exercise and, practice between another individual or multiple individuals, and being fully in service, that everything runs smoother, that I'm better. I find myself being more dexterous as a chess player. I find myself processing more as a reader, as an absorber of content, that it's giving me a richer, lucid dreamscape, that I'm showing up better in the world, that I'm feeling more excited to have eye contact with other beings. And then that's like, wow. And then it's like, then there's this sort of this tap in, where you say, okay, this is a nice tap in. This is worth it, all that commitment. There's really something happening there that then it's no longer worth the commitment. The next stage is, oh, I have to have that.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like,
I know. I was just gonna say, yeah, like, again, chills while you're saying that, because that's, there's been so many times in my life, it's like, what is this all for? And that's where faith for me, and I know that can be a loaded word for some people, but faith in those who have walked this path and left the lights, for me, as I'm coming up the trail. They left little lanterns, metaphorically speaking, as they carried on. And so reading things from Ken and his experiences, or Ram Dass, or whomever it may be, of the many teachers, Alan Watts, Ramana Maharshi, all teachers, Trungpa, and of course Pema Chodron and Sally Kempton, and not to Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach, all of these wonderful, just illuminated teachers, and back to Nagarjuna, and you know all too well. But knowing that these people walked these steps, and they all started somewhere too, and some of them maybe had less karmic residue that they needed to work through, like Ramana, for example, at such a young age with his experience. And but either way, just to know that I'm not alone in that, and that, again, faith, like my heart feels the transmission of these teachers, so I have faith and trust in what they're saying, and that at times has been all that's sustaining me, was that belief that not all of them can be bullshitting me. Like, I don't believe that. And luckily I've had enough experiences at this point, especially recently with that trip to Mount Shasta I mentioned, where it all, like, it was too much. It was, like, in a beautiful way, just too much. So, ooh.
I think it's important too, like, for anyone who's, for listeners on this, is like, to, because this, for people who are ultra intellectual, as a lot of your audience will be, right, that we have a danger also of intellectualizing things.
Yes.
Like, even like to ground all this and to say, like, everyone who's listening or is, tapping into this right now, just taking a deep breath.
Right.
And there's a sense of gratitude, saying, hey, there may be a lot of challenging things in my life, but you know what? I'm just grateful to be right here, right now, talking with you, just sharing here. And then all of a sudden it starts to feel better, and that's the basic practice.
And when you mentioned equanimity, for me, that was one of the hardest things, because stuck in my head, overthinker, overanalyzer, part of why I was attracted to Ken's work in the first place. But making that trip from the head to the heart, and that's where teachings from like Pema Chodron and others, about equanimity, and finding the sense of logic is still important. We can't just throw that completely out. Yet at the same time, for me, especially, and a lot of people that I've talked to, is learning to trust in the feelings and the intuition and the sensations. And Andrew Harvey calls it the direct path of experience, and which has its own pitfalls, because it can very easily be wrapped up in ego, and which we aren't aware of. It kind of slips back in the back door. We might have the purest of intentions consciously, but it's such a tricky thing, this whole spiritual business. But wouldn't trade it for the world. And even that, like, for listeners, I have a lot of listeners that don't like that word, and I understand. It's it's just a word. I don't think it does. No words in the English language will ever do justice to the experience. And that's why, as I know Ken talks about the importance, especially as you're going up from the levels and lines on his quadrants, that direct experience that's beyond doubt. That it doesn't matter what anyone else says, they were not in your body and your skin having that experience. And that experience, when it gets potent enough, is, for me, an experience of non-experience. Like, holy shit, Chris has left the building, and there's just this awareness of, like, I am, as Ken would say, I am, capital I, capital A, I am, or Ram Dass, I am loving awareness, and just anchoring into that. And yeah, I've had that experience I've talked about on the show, at a Slayer concert, of all places, the most heaviest of metal bands ever. And I was up front, I had a photo pass, and I was doing the I am loving awareness mantra, photographing Slayer, flames shooting up on stage. I looked around behind me, thousands of people going crazy. And instead of doing the mantra, as Ram Dass would say, the mantra started doing me, and it was cyclical. And it was just an experience of the interconnectedness of all beings in that moment. There was no more separation. It was just the flames and the amps in an upside down cross position, and people, like, with the devil horns up. And it was sublime. And that's another way that I know that it's very real. It was a direct experience that no one can take from me. I was completely sober, and it was at a Slayer concert. So if it can happen there, to such a degree that it did, what a real thing. So
And maybe even it's not that no one can take that experience from you, but it's that nothing can take you from that experience, right? That experience is happening over the course of the unfolding of millions of years, but beyond time. But it's unfolding in time, right? In years. And then all of a sudden that experience drops through you, right? And that's it. There's that moment where it's like the experience is here, the thing is here, like the electrical current of love. And there's Chris Grosso, the Slayer concert, whoo, it's coming through there, right? And then it's coming through somewhere else, and it's coming through somewhere else, and it's coming through somewhere else, right? And we're opening up to that thing. Yeah, and then there's this awareness of the I beyond I, the I beyond Chris, that is this ultimate, experience, or that God is you're an aperture, right? We're all apertures through which God is able to experience duality. Yeah,
right.
You were like really digging it, getting it, then it's delicious. I feel like I'm at that concert.
Yes, it was awesome. Yeah, but absolutely the dual housed within the non-dual. It's something that I've learned is just honoring the humanity aspect of this, which you very much cover in the film. And maybe this is a great segue, because I'm going to have you back on the show. First of all, thank you for indulging me in this. You did such a wonderful job on the film. I really wanted to get to know the person behind that, because while this is Ken and Treya's story, you're the one who brought that vision to life. So you're ingrained in this as well at the same time, at least from my experience. So, I won't lie to you. I was scared going into it, because that Grace and Grit, like we were saying earlier, is that's my favorite book. One Taste is right up there, but Grace and Grit is definitely my favorite. And I've read it many times over, and it's illumined me. It's broken my heart. I've laughed, I've cried, and I've talked to Ken personally about a lot of the things in there, and so I was nervous going into this film, just like when they adapted Walk the Line, Johnny Cash's story, one of my all-time favorite musician. And I think Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon did a great job, so that's on the record. But I was nervous. And so the same feeling was here. And I will tell you, Sebastian, within, I don't know, a minute, where, Ken was meeting Treya with Roger, and that was very interesting to me, or within a few minutes, so whenever that happened. Because the first time I met Ken in person, Roger was there, and Ken invited me to speak out at the I don't know if it was What Next or What Now conference, but yeah, so I was out there, and the day I flew into Denver, he said, "Come up to the loft," and so I was there with him, and Roger happened to be there, and it was just such a cool experience to not only get to finally meet Ken in person, but no big deal, Roger's sitting there, and that's cool, and so anyways. I am not embarrassed in the slightest to say, for probably about 80 to 85% of this film, I cried. And some of it was crying out of just the haunting pain I was experiencing. Some of it was just crying out of sheer joy and delight. But it was a very visceral experience for me. And I say that with as a compliment. That's why I love authors like Charles Bukowski. When I read him, even though it can be, and his stuff is way different than what you did, but like anything that makes me feel on a very deep level, I absolutely adore. In this film, when I emailed Cassie, I said, this film has struck me like no other film in years, like that I can remember. So all that to say, you did an amazing job, and that doesn't even do justice to how I feel about the film. But let me start by, for anyone that's that's not familiar with Grace and Grit, there's a little movie synopsis that I have from the press kit, very brief. I want to read that just so people understand what we're talking about. And also I want to say, I'm going to have you back on the show, because I want to talk more to you about you. And I could spend this whole time just continuing our conversation, but I want to promote this film and your art. So let me do that, and then we'll have to schedule time to get you back on. But so the movie synopsis, Grace and Grit tells the true story of iconic philosopher Ken Wilber, played by Stuart Townsend, and his wife Treya, played by Mina Savari, a wonderful actress. Based on the acclaimed book chronicling Treya's journals. They fall madly in love in 1980s California and are immediately faced with challenges that tear them apart. They overcome by discovering connection beyond this world and love beyond life. So There was also in the press kit, and I don't usually use stuff like this, but I thought you worded it so well. There's a couple of pieces I pulled from that I wanted to share with the listeners and kind of use as a segue for you to expand on and go in any other direction. But if you don't mind me reading a couple of these things, I would love to do that. So one of them, it had said, and you already touched on this a little, but to reiterate, when I first read Grace and Grit, it shook me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then I read about how others around the world felt the same way, that this story offered some sort of hope about life, that it perhaps conveyed a meaning about what we are ultimately doing here. The book left me in tears, yet somehow inspired. I felt that Ken and Treya's story epitomized what was possible with romantic, courageous, compassionate, fearless, and ultimately selfless love. It marked a standard for relationships that I already intuited was alive within me, yet that I still wish to experience in this lifetime. So that when you said it shook you, those were verbatim. As soon as I was messaging Carissa, who I mentioned earlier, my lady, the words I used were, this film just shook me to the core. It shook me in my bones. It was the most hauntingly beautiful thing I've experienced in a long time. So it was interesting to me that you used that it shook me, because that's a bold statement. So I was wondering, boy, where to go with this? I know you've already talked a little bit about it, but can you walk readers through your experience reading Grace and Grit? Maybe for the first time or even the second time, and why it struck you so deeply. What was it about the story that really just called to your heart and had whatever effects on you that it did?
I read it. I'd already read Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and A Brief History of Everything, and Integral Psychology, and No Boundary, and a number of other Ken's books. And this was the first book of his that I read that was a story with characters that weren't conceptual, that weren't God and spirit, and etc. Right? And so it's such a deeply personal story for a guy, a man, a thinker who's so reclusive that you can't find many photographs of, you can't find many real interviews with, throughout history. That he has, like, he'll do a talk on something, but that in this book, he goes so open and transparent. Yeah, and it was, wow. Yeah, to be able to see that, if you have a great thinker like, Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, or Ramana Maharshi, or, Jung or Freud, to be able to get in their heads and get in their hearts and get into sense of the people behind the beings that are some sort of portal for such brilliant, extraordinary expression of what's happening here in life. And, Ken is that guy. He's the lighthouse. And so to read that, to jump right in there, I'd say, like, after reading someone that we love, an author that we love, or a musician that we love, we open it up by saying, okay, I'm excited to get into this thing. So I was excited to get into it. And then I opened the first few pages, and right away, it was so intimate. The first pages, it was so emotional, And the first 20 pages is so romantic, right? I mean, it's so romantic, and it just pulled me right in. And I think as a book, because for people who haven't read it, it's written by her journals, and then it's also Ken's experience of what happens at that time. So it's written by two authors, essentially. Yeah. And then he has he then describes what was occurring between them psychologically and spiritually, and then they also have the sequences of their dreams that are in italics. So what an intense book. And you would go to a bookstore back then, you didn't know if it was going to be in spirituality or biography or psychology, or, you didn't know where it was going to be, because it was, all these different things in one. No, a book's never been written like this book forever. Right. And so when I got into it, I didn't even know what to expect. And I think the book is experiential, right? The book is 400 pages. Most people love the first 100 pages. And then they get to about page 250 and they're like, okay, now it's getting really brutal and I can't take it anymore. I get it. I know what happens at the end. But they're only halfway there. And that's exactly what happens in most yoga practices, in most gymnast practices, in most distance swimming practices, in most healing practices, and in most spiritual practices. We get to the point where we say, oh, I already think I know. But, of course, in Grace and Grit at page 250, it gets intense and it gets heavy and heavier and heavier, and then lighter, really light, and then really heavy again. And then if you can stay in it at the end, it's like the whole thing has been simmering slowly, this slow cooking meal, that at the end it just boom, it's this grenade, right? At the very end, the last pages, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And I mean, and everyone around the world feels like that. You don't have to like the book, you don't have to enjoy the experience, but everyone around the world, for the most part, feels like that.
Yeah.
Frances Fisher, who plays Nina's mother in the movie, she's a dear friend and has done a couple projects with me, and I gave her the book, and she would message me. Then when she read the script, she would say, "Oh my God, Sebastian, I'm reading it so slowly. I don't want it to end. I've got like 7 pages left, and I don't want to finish it tonight because I don't want it to come to the last page. I'm crying my eyes out." And the number of people who've told me that I've given the book to, and then later the script to. So the end was so like in Titanic or like in any great love story, right? The lovers have to be torn apart. It's the confronting of our own mortality that allows us to know that love lives on, that this flower falls from the tree, but another flower will bloom. We will ultimately bloom as another flower. Yeah, this song is going on, and it's happening through us. And I think that book expressed this song of love. Yeah, this song of Eros, this song of ultimately this transcendent music that was happening through these two glorious individuals, and it showed them in their absolute best and their absolute worst.
Yeah.
That we get to experience rising up with them, fumbling, falling, getting totally scraped up, and rising again. And wow, when we can say that and look at that and observe that between two hugely admirable human beings, then we say, well, all right, I know what's possible within me. This is a reference point for what's possible. This is a reference point for what's possible in forgiveness, that I can forgive myself, and I can forgive another. This is a reference point for what's possible in commitment. This is the kind of commitment that someone can give, a man to a woman, a woman to a man, or two men or two women, or friends or lovers or father and mother and child and vocation, whatever the thing is, whatever the service is. This is a reference point for what's possible in commitment. Ultimately, this is a reference point for what's possible in love. We come up with new architecture, new poetry, new books, new songs, all about love, because we're always trying to seek, how do we find that thing? How do we open up to that current in our life? That it always can elude us and throw us off, and then we open up to it, and it feels so good when we open up to it. And this book is a reference point on how to open up to it, on how to surrender and allow love in.
Yeah.
Not concerned with whether it shatters us, not concerned with whether it makes us fly high, but to open up whatever love is going to bring. And so that's when I say shaken by the book, that's what I experience when I read.
So I'm not going to bother reading the other thing out of the statement, because I want to flow with you here on this. And that's how I like the conversations to go. I think we've already kind of covered some of it anyways, but so you take this just incredible book, like you said, 400 pages, and distill it into an hour and 50-minute movie. There was, as we were saying earlier, or as I said, you made it very accessible, I think, to viewers that aren't familiar with Ken's work. Now, I hope that those who watch the film go and read the book, because, of course, there's so much more in those pages. So I'm curious, how did you decide which? I mean, there were the obvious parts you needed to include, but aside from those, like, how did you decide what to take, especially in regards to like the parts where Ken gets pretty heavy in his teachings? There are sections where he will go into, the casting of the net and playing hide and seek, the Leela, the dance, and my words, but he talks about a lot of that throughout the book. And there were sequences in the movie like where I remember when earlier on when Ken was laying down in his bed and Treya was in her bed, or Stuart and Mina in this case, and he's thinking, and you see him kind of sit up, and then she's thinking, and that gets into some of the more like cosmic consciousness kind of vibe. But again, distilled and shared in a way that's easy to, I think at least, understand and follow. So yeah, how did you, I know you said the film called you, so maybe that's similar. Like you just, did you intuitively know what needed to be in there? Or, were there conscious choices? Did you talk to Ken about it? Like, what was the process of putting that all together? And then follow-up question, I'll get to that after. I don't want to cloud you too much. Let's go with that for now.
So yes, I wanted to make something accessible. My first documentary was like 90 minutes and it was all philosophy. It was a lot of stuff in there and I loved it. And I screened it in Hawaii and a lot of people came. Everyone in the philosophy department loved the movie. Everyone else said, this is what the hell just happened in this movie.
What is that called? Because I want to check it out.
Awakening World. And it's a very simple 40-minute accessible documentary. What's the purpose of life? What's love? What's heaven? What's hell? What's intimacy? The trailers everywhere. Awakening World.
Okay.
Beautiful, simple, very accessible film. And what ultimately came from that film is the value. I put the whole thing on my American Express card. It's the devotion to these exploration of these questions: purpose, love, heaven, hell, intimacy. And what was of value was the discussion that people would have afterwards. What is love? What is intimacy? What is the heaven and the hell that we can create? Right? What is purpose? And so, in that same way. If it's not accessible, no one's going to open up to it, right?
Right.
So I know that, Ken Wilber, there are many brilliant authors out there who are hugely popular because they are accessible. And these authors are so important in and of themselves, but also as gateways to deeper practices. Ken is not that accessible. He doesn't write books for popular consumption.
Right.
He's not trying to. He could easily. He's not trying to. He's trying to push the edge of consciousness. He's writing what's coming through him. So automatically there's a simpatico between any two people. Anyone who's listening to this, if you want to run an experiment, take a Ken Wilber book, whether you've read it or not, and carry it around for a month. You will make some amazing friends. Not a lot of people will come up to you and ask you about that book, but the people who do, you're going to hit it off with. I promise you that. In other words, there is a requisite entry point where if you're reading Ken Wilber, it means you've already read 100 other books, right? Or a dozen other books that you've already read, a certain amount of philosophy, psychology, etc. For anyone who's not already reading his work, No Boundary, Grace and Grit, Up from Eden, One Taste, those are the most accessible works.
Right.
Best first reads. If somebody's reading an enormous amount of philosophy, psychology, spirituality, probably A Brief History of Everything is the great first one.
I love that.
But point being is that I wanted to make something. I wanted to tell this glorious story of Grace and Grit in a way that somebody would not need to be familiar with him. That they could be, and that I need to serve that audience, and I need to serve that story. I need to obviously honor, above all, Treya and Ken. But that I want to welcome people into the table. I want to welcome people in to say, hey, this is what's possible with love. This is how what I discovered what was possible as a reference point in love. And so I'd love you to take a glimpse of this. Like the book is experiential. At page 250, you want to tap out, and then you stay in there, and it's glorious and majestic. The movie is the same way. This is not a movie for everyone. It is a movie for everyone, but it is not a movie that is a light popcorn fare. Somebody has to be willing to say, like the Tree of Life, or like the Fountain, or like Black Swan, I'm going to sit in this thing and feel what's going on here. Yeah. Anybody who wants a real emotional, intellectual experience is going to love this movie. That's our hope. Yeah. But I wanted to make it a little bit wider so that if somebody at home wants that experience, but they're with someone who doesn't, they can still enjoy it together and have a good conversation about it.
Yeah.
All right.
Which you definitely did. And when I say accessible, I want to be clear. I don't think you took it this way, but for listeners, it is not watered down at all. And you make a good point, because even though it's accessible, it's not a movie for everybody, for sure. If you're, no, I don't want to say that. I was going to say, if you're like in a depressed state, you might want to wait to watch it, but who knows? It could be the key that unlocks that depression for you. Who am I to say, what someone else should or shouldn't do? But for me, so before I go further, I love that thing about carrying a Ken book around with you and just see what happens. It made me think of, it's probably like 5 years ago. I was in a Goodwill, and I don't remember exactly which. It could have even just been like the Essential Ken Wilber, something like that. I found it for $2, and I picked it up for a friend, and I was standing in line, and there was an older gentleman behind me, and he goes, And you know, if you see me, I'm covered in tattoos, like a hardcore punk rock hip hop kind of skateboarder. And he looked at me and he kind of had this confused look and he was like, Ken Wilber? And I was like, yeah, you heard of him? He goes, yeah. He goes, you've heard of him? I go, yeah, he's actually a friend. He wrote the foreword for my second book. We've done programs together. And this guy wouldn't believe me. It was so funny. Like, he's like, no. And I was like, no, I'm serious. And everyone else I'd met, this is the one Ken interaction that was a little weird for me. But I had just come from the library around the corner. This was in Middletown, Connecticut, and they have a really wonderful library called Russell Library. And they have a bunch of, like, a ton of Ken stuff. That's where I found Cosmic Consciousness many years ago. And they have my books. And I said to him, I'm like, are you familiar with Russell Library? And he goes, yeah. And I go, he's like, I have a card there. And I said, well, if you want, here's the name of the book. You can go take a look. Ken wrote the foreword. And anyways, he ended up messaging me. He found me on social media. He's like, I'm sorry I doubted you. And you know, it was just a really nice exchange. And I'm grateful that he saw that it's not just the quote unquote typical intellectual looking people that resonate. It can be anybody. And that's what I love about Ken too, is that he does not give a shit about external appearances. He is more, I think, I don't mean to speak for him, but much more interested in the person and the intent, their integrity. Like you said, he could, of course, write a best-selling book. You know, he knows that equation, or he has written best-selling, but I mean like a watered down, sells trillions of copies. I know for listeners, he's turned down Oprah on several occasions for interviews. To me, that's integrity. Like, you know, you can, if you could go on Oprah, like that's going to be a, you know, obviously a career boost, but Ken's not interested in that. And um, I wrote a piece for Huffington Post about, like, I think it was called Who is Ken Wilber? Because it's either you know him or you don't. And I just wanted to introduce more people to his work. Hence why we're having this conversation as well. And I want to honor your art. But yeah, that's what I love about Ken. And he's just in it for the raw authenticity and expanding and pushing the boundaries of consciousness and helping us. And 600-page books, like his trilogy, you know, The Religion of Tomorrow, one of his more recent works. And I was talking to him the other day and he's working on another 600-page. Anyways, absolutely love that. If you have any comments on that, please feel free. And then the other part I wanted to ask about the filming was, I found it so ethereal and so, like, hauntingly beautiful. It had this vibe, this energy to it, without even the actor, without Stewart or Mina or Mariel Hemingway who's in it, or Francis who you mentioned. It had this very, just like, ethereal is the word that's coming to mind. And hauntingly beautiful were two things I felt, and visceral. So that was the second part of the question I was asking you before. Is I'd love if you could talk about that. Was that intentional? Did that just kind of unfold as you were making it? So yeah, if you had any feedback on what I just said, please feel free. And then back to the film.
Yeah, in terms of the spark, like what you were saying specifically about interiors, in other words, being interested in individuals, whoever the individuals are, however life and God shows up, the spirit shows up, the electrical spark shows up in ways that we're never going to know. No matter how brilliant any individual is, we're never as brilliant as the edge of consciousness extrapolation. So we always have to be humbled by that and allow it to come through. And it might just come through, boom, and that little, we might see something in the eyes of that puppy or that baby or that other person or that thing that this person that we presume something about, that we like or don't like.
Right.
You spark. In other words, we can't see it if we're not available to it. But if we're available to it, all of a sudden, it starts showing up everywhere.
Yes.
Right? Synchronicity starts happening all the time. The wider our eyes are open, the more synchronistic occurrences we're experiencing, because everything is intertwined. Right, yes. By just common sense, you know, in the very Alan Watts kind of way, just by common sense, everything is entwined. I saw this. I like to watch a lot of true story movies, and I watched recently The Man Who Knew Infinity. This was about Ramanujan, and this, you know, this guy's a clerk in India, and then he goes, you know, he's trying to go to Oxford or Cambridge, and nobody wants to accept him because he's a clerk, and he's written this brilliant theorem, and everyone's like, this is nonsense. It's not possible. And then finally, one guy reads it, and he's like, oh my God, he's brilliant. We have to invite him, and they invite him, and he really changes mathematics. Yeah, and it's between 1914 and 1919 during the Spanish flu, and then he passes. You know, but hadn't someone not been open to this young guy, uneducated, but he just had this spark, knew mathematics, you know, in such a way, you know, that somebody said, I want to collaborate with this guy. And I think that what you're saying about, you know, Ken or anyone else who's brilliant, There is a CEO level, and the CEO's job is to say no. In other words, is to be conservative in any company, because it's to keep the company afloat and be conservative. Don't take risks that are going to sink the company. But the visionary, that person's job is to say yes, right? Because that's the person who starts the company when everyone says it's impossible to start this company. So the visionary is oftentimes going to take a risk on someone who's not a CEO, whereas the CEO will not, right? Because vision is more open-minded, right? In other words, pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. Post-conventional is more open-minded than conventional. Conventional is very open-minded. That's why, as Ken talks about the pre-trans fallacy, without going on a tangent, those two things look alike from the outside in. Point being that the spark can happen, anywhere. And I think that that's one of the things that I get from the writings of, whether it's Joseph Campbell or Alan Watts or Ram Dass or Ramana Maharshi or Ken Wilber, is that I allow myself to be open to the miracle, and the miracle's out there. I'm not waiting for it to happen. It's happening. Where can I see it? You know what I mean? Like, just turn on the show. It's everywhere, right? Like, get Satori and look around, right?
Yes.
So, open-mindedness and the availability to allow the miracle in is huge. Otherwise, I never would have directed this film. I was available to all the yeses and the no's that opened other doors, and the yeses that I never thought were correct, that I didn't necessarily think were correct or not correct, but that I allowed in, that were like amazing in ways that beyond my imagination. What you touched on there about creating the ambiance of sort of ethereal intensity, a kind of beyond life, that ultimately this is, it's a story, man beats woman, they fall in love, there's a challenge, they come together, it's very romantic, they come apart, there's a reconciliation, and then she passes at the end. So simple plot, right? Basic love story, Titanic, Romeo and Juliet, love story, The Notebook, etc., all the same story. But really, this is a book, this is a story, this is a movie about love beyond life. Yeah, it's a story about transcendence. It's a story about the moon, the sun, the stars, as is happening through these two individuals, as is happening through us. And it is experiential. I want the audience to sit in the movie and experience the hope, the romance, the letdown, the elation, the majesty. And so in order to do that, that's expressed through those brilliant actors. It's expressed through the set design, through the colors, it's expressed through the light, it's expressed through the music. And it's all these things that film is a very unique medium to be able to, in such a short period, in 90 minutes or 2 hours, to be able to experience all these things, to suffuse, in other words, 400 plus pages of experience as a teaser in just an hour and a half or 2 hours. If somebody's interested in Ken Wilber, check this out. It'll open up it'll open audiences up to his work in some way that's not heady. There's not a heady film. It's heady for people who are already heady, but it's an emotional film, And so to convey those things, just as a craftsman, as a director, there's a very specific, choices made around actors, made around colors, made around costumes, made around locations, homes, music, light, lenses, every single detail. In order to subtly convey those things that any specific audience person, unless they're a filmmaker, probably won't notice, but that are used as mechanisms, to try to create that feel, like in A Black Swan, or like in The Fountain, or like in The Tree of Life.
Right.
Did you see Malik's new film, recent film, maybe a year and a half ago, A Hidden Life?
No, I've not seen
that. Love that. It's a beautiful film.
So I have to grab a pen after we get off. I'm going to jot some things down you've mentioned.
Beautiful film, and I bring it up because it's experiential, and his style in that is, pertinent to Grace and Grit. Is I want the audience to feel a flux of time, so that we get in the first 3 minutes. It's who, what, when, where, why. We know exactly who, what they're doing. We're right there with them, and slowly, I want to bend time a little bit forward, a little bit back, because that's how we experience our life. We think about our love for any being in our life. We think about the moment we feel through a feeling. There's a subtle flavor. There's a subtle echo that lets us know that experience with that person or with those people. And if I can convey that in film, then, and if I can take the audience there, if the audience can go there, then that really feels like, after even just, an hour and 48 minutes, it feels like, wow, I've really been with these people for, I really get the sense of scope of many years in just this short period. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you did just an incredible job of distilling that down, again, from 400 pages into that time. So I know we're a little over on time. Can I hold you up for another minute or two? Because
Sure.
there's a couple things I definitely wanted to ask you. I mean, a ton of things. Like I said, we're gonna have to find a time to get you back on. But so no spoilers here. I mean, Treya dies at the end. You've already said that. The word emotional you've mentioned a few times, and as I said, I cried through the majority of this film. A lot of it was a cry of joy. A lot of it was a cry of pain, and especially knowing Ken on a personal level. No, it doesn't matter if you see this book or this film, excuse me, you'll feel it. But if you've read the book and have a little more context, I think it might lend itself to an even deeper experience, perhaps. But that final scene, before you show the actual footage of Treya, where Stuart's holding Mina as she's, Treya is transitioning, Ken is holding Treya. That elicited in me such like an ugly cry. I was literally gasping for breath. Like I could barely breathe. It was so intensely emotional for me. Yeah, like I'm actually starting to tear up a little bit right now, just seeing it. Or in my mind's eye, I'm seeing it as I'm talking about it. And after the film ended, when you go to Treya and there's a little bit of Ken's actual voice talking. I watched the credits all the way through, which I never do. Not, I think because I wanted to give credit to everyone who worked on the film, being transparent here. I couldn't move. I was just like sobbing and trying to breathe. And I remember texting the woman, Chris, I've mentioned a few times, like, I can't breathe. Like, I was nervous I was going to have an anxiety attack. It was just, I felt it. And I don't want to scare anyone away. It was that beautiful. It was that beautiful that it hit me so hard. So, I don't know anything about filmmaking. Well, I know very little about filmmaking, but while you were there working on that scene, and Ken, and that story, how was that for you? And maybe just me as a viewer, like maybe there were other scenes you directed that were more powerful for you. I don't know, but for me as a viewer, that scene just it like destroyed me in a beautiful way. So how was that like for you, filming that and putting that to screen?
First of all, thank you. That is beautiful.
Thank you.
I mean, that's why I made this picture, to have, for someone like you to have an experience like that. Thank you so much. And that gives me a sense that I've done duty, and service, because that's why I love the book, and that's why I wanted to make it into a film. As a craftsman, in just sort of very practical ways, to take a step away from the ethereal and the abstract, I break the book down into 4 100-page sections and decide what to leave in, what stays in, is left out but stays in just metaphorically.
Sure.
You pick up a lot on, what of his work gets put in there. There's a little bit of the lingo in there. There's a little bit of the philosophical integral vernacular in there at some point. But I don't want to make it heady, so I put a lot of that stuff in there, and imagery and music, and there are so many scenes. When I was adapting the screenplay, I took a period of, I don't know how long, a few weeks, to my final first draft, where I'm acting out every part, because I want to make sure every part is true. So every role, I'm literally acting it out with myself, and I'm feeling it, and and I'm crying when I'm writing it, and I'm laughing when I'm writing it, and someone was staying with me at the time for that period, and I would catch myself once in a while. I'd look up and I'm doing a full scene, when I'm at I look like a crazy person, right? And so I cried enormously, obviously, when I was writing it, and then, and then in the editing of it, and then in the casting of it, and then, and then in the shooting of it. It's really fun. Like, there's nothing like shooting a movie. It's wonderful, and to see that come alive, through these actors and through all the other mechanisms that deliver it onto the screen is spectacular. So, when we got to that scene, and I shot mostly chronologically, I wanted, if we could, it's just with a story that takes place over 6 years, 5 years. It's great for the crew. It's great for the actors to be able to have a sense of the chronology.
Right.
It's great for makeup. It's great for everybody.
Yeah.
If you can do it, if and when you can do it. So we did for the most part. So that was one of the last things that we shot. I love movies. And there are so many movies that have affected me since I was a kid. And I've seen some great scenes of passing, of death. But I thought, I really want to do something that is both true to the source material, true to their experience, true to her journals, true to his writing, but also that's never been done in film that I'm aware of, that's something that's so real. In other words, I have a duty to anyone who's ever loved someone who's died in their arms. I have a duty to every single one of those people, both the person who is dying and passing and the person who is holding that loved one, whether it is a child or a lover or a sibling or a parent. And it doesn't happen like it happens in the movies. It happens like this. It happens like it happens in this movie.
Yeah.
I wanted to just deliver that as real as I possibly could. And these two brilliant actors, Stuart and Mina, I could not imagine retrospectively any other two actors on the planet playing these roles.
Yeah.
And it just was, the timing was right there, and it just came through, and and it was spectacular to shoot it. When we were actually shooting that scene, we have what's called a closed set, so it's very intimate and quiet, and we're outside the room and they're inside the room, and my DP's inside the room, and then I'm outside and I'm looking at the monitor, and we've talked through the scene lots, etc., and directed it, and we know exactly what we're doing. And when I'm watching this scene happen, we're shooting one shot on Stuart and one shot on Mina, and I'm starting to get a little teary-eyed as I'm watching it because it feels true.
Yeah.
And then I look over and I see like someone in makeup, and they're just like bawling, they're just watching it. And then I look over at one of my producing partners, and this particular guy, he's the sweetest guy, but he never shows any emotion. And he's like this. He's watching like this. He's watching like this to cover the tears from his eyes. And I said, nah, man, this is beautiful. We got it. Like, we got it. Like, this truthfulness is being delivered on screen. And that's the job of an actor. And that's the job of a musician. And that's the job of a poet. And that's the job of a dancer. And that's the job of a filmmaker, to deliver truth to the screen, ultimately. Whether it's a 3-minute movie, a comedy, or a romance, or a drama, or a biopic, to deliver truth, as much truth as we can put into the art, into the words. And so it was such a pleasure and an honor to be able to, write and produce and direct this movie and that scene.
Well, yeah, my hat is off to you, because I tried to think about myself in your role. You're the director, and having to keep it together, like when I do workshops and facilitate and having to hold that space. Like, there are times I will have to fight back tears because I'm trying to, hold that space. And sometimes I'm just like, whatever, I need to let some tears out. And I think it's that raw vulnerability that really helps other people, like, lay aside their hard armor and connect at a deeper level. And with your film, I think a part of why it resonated so deeply with me is I am attracted to all things raw, authentic, vulnerable, just real. And that transmission comes through in this film. It is a very real piece of heart work and artwork, but not to be corny, but heart work is the word that's coming up. That's part of what I felt in it. And I cannot sing its praises highly enough. This conversation doesn't even begin to, scratch the surface of just the magnitude of this film and the mastery with which you did adapt it to the screen from that book. Kind of at a loss for words. There's so much I was like, oh, I want to pick that apart a little more. And that's, again, why I'm going to have you back on, Sebastian. The film, first of all, it's available. I rented it through, I believe, Amazon, but it's like on YouTube, Amazon, pretty much most places you can rent the film, correct?
Most streamers, yeah, Apple, Amazon. It's everywhere in North America, Canada, US, and then international will probably be September. I think it's being orchestrated now. The end of sometime in September, I think so.
Awesome.
But
And
anyway,
so,
now, in North America, everywhere movie stream.
cool. So before we end, I wanted to ask two things. One, if I don't know, as a direct, well, no, you're an author too. If there's a place people can go to find your work, whether it's social media or you have a website to not just learn more about Grace and Grit, but as you mentioned, you have that previous documentary, and I know you have a bunch of things coming out. So I wanted to ask if there's any of that you are at liberty to talk about or give us a little hint at, because personally, I'm very excited to see what's next after this and visiting your old documentary. So that, and also, is there anything we didn't cover about the movie that you want to leave listeners with? Because again, there's so much more to this film than we were able to discuss in this short time. So if there's anything we didn't cover that you wanted to share, please feel free to take this opportunity to do that as well.
I was in Sedona a week ago or something, and Mary Munson went out there with me. We screened it at the Sedona Performing Arts Center, and big, sold out audience, and people loved the movie, and people cried, and people laughed a lot throughout the film. And when I showed it to Ken, he laughed a lot. But there's a lot of comedic moments in there, so I don't want audience to feel like they're not supposed to laugh. They are. There's a lot of really funny stuff in there. I don't play it for laughs, but it's funny.
Agreed.
And the number of people, though, that were in Sedona, the audience skews a little older, who stood up afterwards and said, that was my story.
Mm.
Yeah, that I lost my love and now I'm remarried, but that was my story. And that they said that they felt the film was so uplifting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that it was devastating and uplifting.
Yes.
Right? Like all the great love stories. And in a time when we are separated by so many things, rules and technology and insecurities and concerns about appropriateness and illness, and the artworks that penetrate our soul are the ones that allow us to, and even feeling that breath in a microcosm, making the next moment more rich. I think that this film is that. Yeah, that the number of people who called me and said, "Hey, I really want to watch your film, but I lost someone. I can't watch it. It's too close for me." And I said, No. This film is for you.
Yes.
No. You're supposed to watch it. Like, this is for you. This is not, oh, somebody dies, it's a bummer. This is for you. This is a story about love beyond life. Right? So it's a deeply hopeful film, and I think that it was important to have that electrical current that is in the book. And when when I went online after I read the book, and I was seeing reviews in German and Latin, and German and Latin American Spanish and Japanese and Russian, that people felt the same way. That they were like, this rocked me, and yet I was so full of hope that I'm not afraid of death, and I'm not afraid of love. I'm not afraid to believe in love again. This was the reoccurring theme. And so I think that is, and I think that that's hinted at in the trailer. So I want obviously audiences to know that. Also, that now a film like this requires that audiences review it online if they like it, if they watch it, leaving a review wherever that is, on Rotten Tomatoes, Amazon. That most people who will rent a movie now will read what do audiences say.
Right.
A lot of people are paid to critique stuff this way or that way, and that's a bit of a charade. But audiences fortunately hold the power. So that if people see this, if they like it, or if they just, even if they don't like it, if they feel that it's something important for someone else to see, this is the kind of artwork that, look, we're not trying to make tons of money here by making a movie like this. We're trying to be in service to something. I've been in service to something, and so audiences who are awake and tender and sentient are responding very, very promisingly. So if you're someone who is tender and awake, you'll love this film, I hope. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
And if you want to message me also, I don't use a lot of social media, but I do use Instagram. It's an easy way to reach me, and there's a lot of stuff on my site that I update. So
cool. So just by your name, Sebastian Siegel. Cool. Well, and for those listening, if you scroll down here on the Be Here Now website, we'll have those links right there. So you just click on them. It'll take you to them. Or if you're on your phone, just click. And that way you can follow Sebastian and all of his journeys and exciting things that you will be bringing into the world, hopefully sooner than later. So yeah, what a pleasure. What an honor. Thank you for bearing with me as I fumbled through a lot of my words, because this film really, when something really touches me and it has a deep impact, I know it's a good thing when I'm having trouble speaking some semblance of eloquence to it, which I feel like I did this conversation. So that's a good thing, and I'll own that. And I appreciate it. I hope everyone that listens, please watch this film. And as Sebastian said, even if it maybe doesn't sound like it's for you, if someone else comes to mind that might benefit from it, it's available pretty much everywhere streaming is. And we'll have a link to the film as well for at least a couple of streaming services. And if that's not linked on the Be Here Now page, just Google it, and I'm sure many options will come up to stream it. So Sebastian, thank you so much for your time, for the gift of this film, for the what I can't even begin to imagine, the labor, the joy, heartbreak, the ups and downs that must have went into creating this. I can only begin to imagine. So thank you for enduring that for all of us, the people that get to witness that art. And of course, many thanks to Ken and Treya and Grace and Grit, the book. And that's what the film is. Purely, it is equal parts grace and grit. So yes, it is not just a downer film at all. It is very uplifting. I definitely laughed as well, and it felt appropriate. So please watch this film. The links, just scroll down there and check out Sebastian, follow his work. And yeah, Sebastian, thank you so much. Truly means everything to have you on the show.
Chris, thanks so much for all you're doing. And thanks so much for having me on. It's such a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah. All right. Until next time, which will be sooner than later. Thank you very much.